My aunt grabbed my arm in the hospital hallway and whispered 4 words that changed everything. Check your father's briefcase. Then she walked away before I could ask what she meant. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began. My name is Brielle Fontaine. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a financial analyst at a mid-size accounting firm in Mississauga, Ontario. I drive a 12-year-old Honda Fit that rattles when the temperature drops below -10, which in Ontario means it rattles roughly 6 months out of the year. I rent a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a house in Port Credit, and my landlord, Mr. Okafor, is the kindest man I've ever met. He shovels my walkway without being asked and leaves containers of his wife's jollof rice outside my door during the holidays. That detail matters, because during the worst years of my life, Mr. Okafor's kindness was the closest thing I had to family warmth. My father's name is Brielle Fontaine. He built a commercial real estate company from nothing, started with a single strip mall in Brampton in the late 1980s, and by the time I was a teenager, Fontaine Properties had holdings across southern Ontario. He is the kind of man who wears a watch that costs more than most people's cars and considers that perfectly normal. He shakes hands like he's testing your grip strength. He has opinions about everything and states them as facts. My mother, Diane, was a high school art teacher before she married him. She used to paint watercolors on Sunday mornings. I haven't seen her pick up a brush since I was maybe 8 years old. My brother's name is Dominic. He's 2 years older than me, 33, and he has worked at Fontaine Properties since he graduated from Western with a business degree. He has our father's build, our father's handshake, and our father's certainty that the world was arranged specifically for his benefit. He drives a Range Rover. He lives in a house in Oakville that our father purchased for him outright as a 30th birthday gift. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with a stone patio that my father paid a landscaper $7,000 to install. When I turned 30, my father gave me a Kate Spade wallet. I said thank you and meant it, because by then I had learned to calibrate my expectations. The two of them, my father and Dominic, had a dynamic I'd watched my whole life and never fully understood until I was an adult. They golfed together, they attended Leafs games together. They spoke in a shorthand about deals and properties and margins that excluded everyone else in the room, including my mother. When Dominic made a mistake at work, my father called it a learning experience. When I once, at age 22, suggested to my father that diversifying into residential properties might be worth considering, he looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd just confidently mispronounced a common word. Stick to your spreadsheets, Brielle. That was my place in the Fontaine family. Numbers were acceptable from me. Opinions were not. For years, I told myself this was just how he was. Old-fashioned, difficult, a product of his generation. I made excuses the way my mother had taught me to make excuses, quietly and without drawing attention to the fact that you were doing it. Then came the February long weekend 2 years ago, and everything I thought I understood collapsed. My father had a heart event. That's what my mother called it when she phoned me at 7 in the morning on the Saturday of Family Day weekend. Not a heart attack, a heart event, as if naming it more gently might reduce its severity. He'd been rushed to Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga. He was stable. I should come. I drove there in the dark and the cold, my Fit rattling the whole way, and I sat in a waiting room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee until a doctor came out and told us he had experienced a significant cardiac episode and would need surgery the following week. He would recover. He would need rest and lifestyle changes and monitoring. He was, the doctor said, lucky. My mother cried with relief. Dominic nodded firmly, like he was accepting a business update. I stared at the floor and felt something complicated that I didn't have a name for yet. It was during those days at the hospital, while my father was recovering in a private room that Dominic had arranged and paid for on the company card, that my aunt appeared in the hallway and grabbed my arm. My aunt, my father's younger sister, Renee, lived in Halifax, and we rarely saw her. She and my father had what our family diplomatically called a complicated relationship, which meant they exchanged Christmas cards and nothing else. She had flown in when she heard about the cardiac episode, which surprised me. My father had seemed less than thrilled to see her. "Check your father's briefcase," she said. Her eyes were very steady. Then she was gone, walking toward the elevator in her gray coat before I had processed a single word. I stood there for a long moment. I almost convinced myself I had misheard her. But I hadn't. I want to be clear about something. I am not someone who goes through people's belongings. I pay my own bills. I stayed in my lane for 31 years. I built a quiet, independent life, specifically because I had learned that asking for more than I was offered in my family led nowhere good. So when I tell you that I went back to my parents' house that evening, while my mother was still at the hospital and Dominic was in a meeting he apparently couldn't reschedule, and I sat down in my father's home office and opened his briefcase, I need you to understand what it took for me to do that. I need you to understand that I had spent my entire life suspecting something was wrong without ever letting myself look directly at it. The briefcase was a Hartman. Dark brown leather. He kept it on the credenza behind his desk. It wasn't locked. My father, I think, never imagined anyone in his house would have the nerve. Inside, beneath a folder of property documents and a copy of the previous quarter's financials, was an envelope. It was already open. Inside the envelope was a report from a private genetics laboratory in Toronto, dated 14 months earlier. I read it 3 times before the words stopped rearranging themselves. The report was a paternity analysis. The samples were identified only by code, but there was a handwritten note clipped to the front in my father's writing. I know his handwriting like I know my own, with 2 names, my name and Dominic's. The results indicated that one of us was not his biological child. The result indicated that child was Dominic. I sat on the floor of my father's office for a very long time. Here is what I understood in that moment, sitting on the hardwood with the report in my hands. My father had known this for over a year. He had ordered this test, received these results, and said nothing. He had continued giving Dominic a house and a salary and a seat at the table and a future built on the Fontaine name, and he had said nothing. He had continued looking at me the way he always had, like I was a minor inconvenience he'd agreed to house until further notice, and he had said nothing. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I locked the house behind me. I drove home in the dark with my fit rattling under me, and I sat in my parking spot for 20 minutes before I went inside. I did not sleep. Let me tell you about the months that followed, because they matter. My father recovered from his surgery. He came home in March, and he was quieter than before. The doctors had told him that stress was dangerous now, that he needed to slow down. He transferred more responsibility to Dominic at the company. He rewrote his will, which my mother told me about in a casual, careful way on the phone one evening, like she was mentioning the weather. "Your father has updated some things," she said. "He wants to make sure the company stays intact. It's mostly Dominic, for continuity reasons. You understand?" I said I understood. I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that my father had tested his children's DNA 14 months ago. He had confirmed that Dominic was not biologically his, and his response had been to update his will and give Dominic more. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. There are a few possible explanations. The one I kept returning to. My father knew, or suspected, that my mother had had an affair. The test confirmed it. And rather than confront the truth, rather than dismantle the version of his family he had built his identity around, he had decided to simply continue, to keep Dominic in place, to keep the business intact, to keep his name attached to a legacy even if the biology didn't support it. And in doing so, he had continued to treat me, his actual biological daughter, as the lesser child. Because acknowledging the test would mean acknowledging what he knew about my mother, and my father, for all his iron certainty about everything else, could not bring himself to do that. I am not excusing my mother. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about her in all of this. Whatever happened, whenever it happened, with whoever it was, she had carried that secret for over 30 years. She had watched me be sidelined and dismissed, and handed a Kate Spade wallet while my brother received a house, and she had said nothing. I do not know what her reasons were. I do not know if she was afraid of him, or protecting herself, or protecting Dominic, or simply too deep into the silence to find a way out of it. I have some compassion for that. It is complicated compassion, but it is there. The months passed. Spring became summer. I went to work, I came home. I had dinner with a friend named Yasmin, who told me I seemed distant, and I told her I was just tired. I ran along the lakeshore on weekends and listened to podcasts, and paid my rent, and did not say anything to anyone about what I had found in my father's briefcase. I was waiting. I wasn't sure for what. Then came Thanksgiving. We do Thanksgiving at my parents' house in Burlington every year. My mother makes a turkey that is technically fine and stuffing from a box that everyone pretends is homemade. My father sits at the head of the table. Dominic sits to his right. His girlfriend, Petra, sits beside him. I sit at the end, nearest the kitchen, which has been my seat since I was a child, and which tells you everything you need to know about the seating arrangements in my family. That year, there were about 14 of us, some cousins, my mother's sister, and her husband. My Aunt Renee was not there. She and my father had had words at some point during his recovery. Her invitation had apparently not been extended. We were most of the way through dinner when my father tapped his glass and said he had a few words. He talked about the year he'd had, the health scare, the recovery, the gratitude he felt for his family. He talked about Fontaine Properties and how proud he was to see it continuing to grow under Dominic's leadership. He raised his glass to Dominic, and everyone raised their glasses, and Dominic smiled the smile of a man who has always expected to be toasted. Then my father said something I had not anticipated. He said he wanted to make a small announcement. He said that in the new year, he intended to formally transfer 49% of Fontaine Properties to Dominic, with the intention of Dominic assuming full ownership upon his eventual retirement. He did not look at me when he said this. No one looked at me. I put down my fork. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. My hand was steady. I was very focused on keeping my hand steady. My cousin across the table, Jada, who is 26 and has the instincts of someone who pays attention, glanced at me quickly and then looked away. My mother began talking about dessert. I excused myself to use the washroom, and I stood in my parents' bathroom for 4 minutes, looking at myself in the mirror above the sink. I looked at my own face, my father's nose, his coloring, his eyes, and I thought about the report sitting in the Hartman briefcase on the credenza in his office. I thought about 14 months of silence. I thought about a 4-bedroom house in Oakville, and 49% of a commercial real estate company. I thought about my aunt's voice in that hospital hallway. Check your father's briefcase. I think she knew. I think she had known for a long time, the way people who are kept outside a secret often sense its shape even without seeing its contents. I think she had been waiting, the way I had been waiting, for a moment when someone would finally look directly at it. That was the moment. I went back to the table. I finished my turkey. I helped my mother bring out the pie. I said goodbye to the cousins and my aunt and Petra, who air-kissed me the way she always did, like the gesture was a formality she'd been asked to perform. When only my parents and Dominic and I remained, I told them I had something to say. Dominic looked up from his phone. My mother's expression shifted into something carefully neutral. My father set down his coffee. I owe everyone here the truth, I said, and I think everyone here deserves to have it. I had made a copy of the report 14 months ago, the evening I found it. I had photographed every page with my phone, standing in my father's office in the quiet of the house, and I had saved it in 3 places: my phone, my personal email, and a cloud folder. I had also, in the months since, retained a family law attorney in Mississauga, a woman named Priya, who was methodical and calm, and had answered all of my questions without judgment. I had not told Priya what I planned to do. I had simply wanted to understand my options before I did anything. I took out my phone. I had the document open. I placed it on the table, facing my father. I watched him recognize what it was. The color left his face in a way I had never seen before. Brielle Fontaine, who once negotiated a commercial lease dispute in front of a room of lawyers without visible emotion, went pale at a dining room table in Burlington, Ontario, on a Thanksgiving evening in October. "Where did you get that?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was the voice of a man who already knew the answer. "You kept it in your briefcase," I said. "You've had it for over a year." Dominic looked at the phone. He looked at my father. He said, "What is that?" My mother made a sound I am not going to describe in detail. It was the sound of 14 months, or possibly 33 years, arriving all at once. "It's a paternity report," I said. I said it clearly and steadily, the way you state a fact in a meeting. Dad ordered it over a year ago. He had both of us tested. The results show that I'm his biological daughter, and that you're not. The silence at that table was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Dominic turned to my mother. I don't know what he was looking for in her face, denial, maybe, or some signal that I was wrong. My mother was looking at the tablecloth. "Mom," Dominic said. She didn't answer. My father stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking at the backyard, at the garden that had gone brown for the season. And here is the thing about that moment that I had not predicted. It wasn't satisfying the way I thought it would be. Standing there, watching my father's back, watching Dominic's face reorganize itself around something he had never been asked to carry before, watching my mother become very still, it wasn't the relief I had imagined. It was something heavier than that. It was the weight of a truth that had needed to exist in the world for a very long time, finally being released from the place where it had been locked. I had not done this for revenge. I need to be clear about that, because what I did next might look like revenge and it wasn't. I said, "I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm not going to court. I'm not contesting the will. What you do with this information is your decision." I picked up my phone. I put on my coat. I said goodnight. I drove home along the lake shore with the windows fogged and the heater working too hard, and somewhere around Clarkson I pulled over because my hands had started to shake finally, belatedly, now that it was over. I sat in the car for a while. Then I drove the rest of the way home. The following weeks were not quiet ones. My mother called me 7 times before I answered. When I did, she spoke for a long time, and I listened, and at the end, I told her that I loved her, and that I needed time. Dominic did not call me at all, which I understood. My father called me once, on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, and said 4 words before I could say anything. "You were right, Brielle." Then he said he needed some time. I told him to take it. Priya, my attorney, told me that regardless of my decision not to contest anything, my father had options he might now choose to exercise of his own accord. That was his decision to make. 6 months later, my father called me again. He asked if we could have coffee. We met at a Tim Hortons in Mississauga, which felt both very ordinary and very appropriate. He looked smaller than he had before his surgery. He wrapped his hands around his cup, and he told me, in the most direct conversation we had had in my entire adult life, that he owed me an apology that he wasn't sure he was capable of making big enough. He told me he had suspected something for years, since before I was born, since a period when he and my mother had been in a difficult place that he had never spoken about. He had ordered the test because he'd needed to know, and when the results came, he had not known what to do with them. He had been a coward, he said. He said that word himself. He had buried the results and tried to continue forward, and in doing so had perpetuated an injustice against me that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. I asked him why he had kept giving Dominic everything if he knew. He thought about that for a long moment. He said, "Because it was easier to keep going than to stop and reckon with what stopping would mean." That is the truest thing my father has ever said to me. What happened with Dominic was harder and slower, and is still in progress, the way these things are when they're real. Dominic went through a period of denial, and then rage, and then, eventually, something quieter. He hired his own attorney, and pursued a conversation with my mother, that I was not part of. He and I had lunch once, about 4 months after Thanksgiving, and we sat across from each other in a restaurant in downtown Oakville and looked at the strangeness of what we were to each other now. The same childhood, the same dinner table, the same parents, in every way that counted for the first 33 years of his life. "I don't know what to do with any of this," he said. "Neither do I told him. That was the most honest conversation we had ever had. I want to tell you about what I did in the spring after all of this happened, because it is the part that matters most to me. For years, I had been setting aside a portion of my paycheck into a savings account I called only to myself, the Independence Fund. It wasn't a lot, analyst. Salaries in Mississauga are decent but not remarkable, but over 7 years it had become something. I had been saving it without a specific plan, the way you save things when you don't know what the future looks like but you want to be prepared for it. In the spring, I used a significant portion of that fund to establish a small bursary at a community college in Brampton, directed at first-generation students in business and financial services programs. I named it for no one. It's just the Fontaine Bursary, which felt right, a name reclaimed, used for something it hadn't been used for before. I didn't tell my father about it before I did it. I told him afterward, over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like you, Brielle." I think he meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. My name is Brielle Fontaine. I am 31 years old. I drive a 12-year-old Honda Fit and I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Port Credit, and my landlord leaves rice outside my door on holidays. My father is a man who made choices I did not agree with, and who is trying, in the slow and imperfect way of a 70-year-old man, to do something different now. My mother is still in the process of figuring out who she is outside the silence she chose. My brother is navigating a truth he didn't ask for. These things are not resolved. They are being lived with. What I know is this: the truth I was afraid of turned out to be less dangerous than the silence protecting it. The document I found in that briefcase wasn't a weapon, it was just information that had been locked in the dark for too long. And what happens to things locked in the dark is that they grow heavier and heavier until the door gives way on its own. I chose when and how the door opened. That was the only thing I controlled. And it was enough. To anyone watching this, who has been made to feel like the lesser version of yourself by the people who were supposed to know you best, I want you to hear this. Your worth was never theirs to assign. It didn't belong to them when they withheld it, and it doesn't belong to them now. The quiet life you built while you were waiting for them to see you clearly, that life is yours. It always was. I have a friend who once told me that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you refuse to hand over, even when they ask. I held on to mine. I hope you're holding on to yours. If this story reached you in some way, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Whatever corner of Canada or beyond, drop it in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the truth, however complicated, is usually better than the silence, maybe share this with them. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourselves.